And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again with another video in my ongoing DC Rebirth series. So this is going to be a video talking about all the out of continuity series and issues in comics during the DC Rebirth era. This is one more video in the series just trimming off kind of excess non-core, non-essential issues within DC Rebirth before I really dive into the core continuity, which I'll be doing relatively soon. So just to recap, this is the entire DC Rebirth universe. This is the 8 sections of the DC Rebirth universe if you're going to be reading it. Obviously, I have recently done a video talking about the things that I've exempt from this, like digital comics and DC Zoom and DC Ink and things like that. But yeah, generally speaking, these are all the comics that people would consider to be part of DC Rebirth or during that era. I've already covered the Young Animal imprint, which is about 108 issues. I've already covered the Deceased section. I've recently covered the Black Label section. And now today I'm going to be covering the Out of Continuity section, which is 157 issues. I know these are relatively small, bullet point by bullet point, and of course the top bullet point there, the main continuity, is going to be about 2,000 issues, but I think it's important that we continue whittling down and spiraling in towards that by honing off all the fat and all the extraneous comics, so when we get to the final bit we are just looking at the pure hardcore deep dive DC Rebirth comics. That said, I do hope that you found the out of continuity videos interesting. There's actually going to be 2 videos in this section because there's quite a lot of out of continuity comics and quite a lot to be said about them. With no further ado, let's jump into it. What do I define as out of continuity? Well, it's all the series that you can see on this generic thumbnail here. This thumbnail is actually designed specifically in terms of how I'm going to be talking about the comics, and that'll make more sense in the next video in this series. But to start with, we can say that all the thumbnails you see here are series that I would define as series that aren't just standalone series, because there's a separate section I'm going to have about standalone series that don't tie into the wider Rebirth continuity but are still kind of Rebirth comics. These out of continuity issues actually contain at least one, if not more, elements that I feel conflicts with the wider narrative of the Rebirth core continuity. And as such, in my mind, I consider them to be Elseworld or otherwise non-canonical stories. So with that out of the way, let's dive into the very first one that I want to talk about. This is roughly in alphabetical order, but again, we're going to be looking at it in these 3 sections, as you can see in the thumbnail. So we're going to be looking at the big load of comics on the right hand side to start with, in roughly alphabetical order. Bane Conquest. So Bane Conquest was published from 2017 to 2018, smack bang in early Rebirth territory. It's a totally Bane focused story. Batman does turn up a couple of times, but is basically a Bane story. It's a 12-issue maxi series that features Bane trying to extend his criminal empire beyond Santa Prisca, which is the prison where he grew up. It's written and drawn by Chuck Dixon and Graham Nolan. And the interesting thing about that is they're the original creators of the Bane character from back in the Nightfall days in the mid-90s. Now, this story was initially, in theory, spun off from the events of the I Am Bane storyline, which is in Batman by Tom King, which is in the mainstream Rebirth universe and continuity. However, as the King run approaches its denouement a couple of years later in the real world, so like 2020-ish, the way the denouement turns out, it increasingly makes it clear that this story by Chuck Dixon is actually a disconnected tangent that doesn't really fit in to the wider story and the actual hardcore central DC continuity. So as a result, I've put it here. Is it good? It's okay. Sort of worth a read, maybe. Next up, we have Batman Creature of the Night. Now, this was published from 2018 to 2019. I originally thought it was a Black Label or a Vertigo type story, but it's not. It's just mainstream branding. It's a 4-issue series written by Kurt Busiek and drawn by Jean-Paul Léon. The interesting thing about this, and again I hadn't realised this at all, it's actually in the very same vein as the story Superman's Secret Identity, which you may be familiar with from the pre-New 52 DC era. I think it came out in about 2004 and similarly is a 4-issue series. Both this and Superman's Secret Identity are really, really good, really interesting stories, well worth a read. But they're set in, for want of a better term, the real world, where there are comic books which star Bruce Wayne as Batman and star Clark Kent and Superman and stuff. And so they're really interesting sort of meta-textual narratives about the concept of comic books and how that intersects with the real world. And I don't want to give anything away, but they're really good, they're really interesting, they're not what you'd expect, and they're absolutely out of continuity. The one criticism I would have of this story is that it's actually quite hard and slightly annoying to read the font in the narrator's speech boxes, because it's in this kind of like cursive Lucida handwriting type font, which is just a bit of a pain to read, to be honest. Next up is this story, which is Batman the Dark Prince Charming. This came out in 2018 and is actually a two-part series. It only came out as 2 issues. Both issues were available as slim hardcover bound issues. They look beautiful. And both of those issues were co-published by DC Comics and a French publishing house called Darjard. And that's because it was written and drawn by a French guy called Enrico Marini. It's a really interesting, really good story. I'm not going to spoil it at all, but it is obviously massively out of continuity. Next up, we have Batman's Grave, which came out from 2019 to 2021, so it actually finished being published just after the Rebirth era ended. This is a 12-issue maxi-series written by the long-standing duo of Warren Ellis as the writer and Brian Hitch as the artist. It features the return of a character called Eduardo Flamingo, who was actually a Grant Morrison kind of introduced character originally. So if you're interested in that, I mean, he's one of the characters in this. But otherwise, it's just a really interesting depiction of Batman. It's a really interesting depiction of Alfred and kind of the Bat canon. It could be argued this is in continuity. I consider it out of continuity because, well, firstly, it's totally parallel and disconnected from what's going on in the mainstream Batman stories of DC Rebirth. But also the characterization of Batman, and especially of Alfred, in fact, is definitively unlike the main characterization in the universe, the main DC universe. Also, the ending pretty much precludes this being part of the mainstream universe, so it very much feels out of continuity. Next up is the first of 2 Deadman related stories. The first one is Deadman Dark Mansion of Forbidden Love, which came out from 2016 to 17. The first thing to know about this is that there was a previous series called Dark Mansion of Forbidden Love, which was actually published in the early 70s, and it was like a horror, romance, suspense, anthology comic book thing that DC did. Back in the 70s, they did loads of these sorts of things, like Tales from the Crypt type stuff. And actually, Dark Mansion of Forbidden Love from the 70s was a companion to another comic series, similarly kind of horror anthology, called Secrets of Sinister House. But after issue 4, the title Dark Mansion of Forbidden Love was changed to Forbidden Tales of Dark Mansion. God knows why. Anyway, if you're Googling it, I'm just to say, those things are out there and you might get confused or a bit sort of distracted by those. This is unrelated to that. What this is this is a 3-issue series which oddly enough was published in prestige format. And by that I mean prestige format is a slightly taller, slightly deeper comic size, which is normally what Black Label was published in. So if you've got, for example, Harleen, which again I will stress you should pick up, it's amazing. The Harleen kind of dimensions, which is magazine size, is what we call prestige format. This was published in the same size, but oddly enough it's not a Black Label series, which is weird. So obviously I've read it. Whether you like it or not is up to whether you like Deadman. What I will say is this is set between the 2006 series and the 2018 series, but both of those are out of continuity, so my decision is to put this one in the out of continuity section. Speaking of Deadman 2018, that's the next one. So Deadman 2018 is this. It's a 6-issue series collected in a trade paperback. If you do get it in single issues, the first issue had a glow-in-the-dark cover, which is kind of cool, but also slightly gimmicky. I'm going to be careful what I say here, because this was written and drawn by Neil Adams. I don't like Neil Adams. I can't stand his writing. I don't have any of his comics. Personally, the minute I see his name on something, I kind of shudder and I'm like, oh god, this is going to be difficult. There was the coming of the Superman in the New 52 era, which was also out of continuity and done by him, which was essentially completely incoherent. If you've read any of the Batman Odyssey comics, they're by Neil Adams. They're just impossible to read. I'm not a fan of his artwork. The writing makes zero sense. I'm just not a Neil Adams fan, but That said, I know many, many, many people are, and I completely respect that. Neil Adams is kind of a titan of the comics industry, much like, almost in the same breath as Stan Lee or Jack Kirby or people like that. Neil Adams came up with some of the key archetypal, most fundamental comic book storylines for characters like Batman, and his art style and the stories that he wrote had a huge impact on the medium. I get that. It's the same reason why Watchmen is so popular, but I don't like Watchmen either. So all I will say is that if you're a Neil Adams fan, you're going to be into this. If you're not a Neil Adams fan, but you feel kind of pressured to be a fan, maybe I should do a video in my other playlist, which is Popular Comics It's Okay Not to Like. Just talking about why I'm not a fan of Neil Adams, and it's okay not to be a fan yourself. But listen, enough of that. All I'm going to say is, clearly I'm not a fan of this. If you are a fan of his writing and his artwork, definitely pick this up. It's just classic Neil Adams. The story is a 6-issue story, and what a lot of people don't realise is that this particular story, Deadman 2018, actually was the first part of a 2-parter. So the ending of this story teases to be continued in Batman Demigod's War. Now, Demigod's War never came out. If you Google it, you won't be able to find it, because whilst the sequel did come out, it was renamed into this, which is Batman versus Ra's al Ghul. So Batman vs. Ra's al Ghul is the next comic we're looking at. It is also in the DC Rebirth era. It's also obviously massively out of continuity. It was published between 2019 to 2021, so again, finished being published just after Rebirth ended. And again, like Deadman, it's a 6-issue limited series written and illustrated by Neil Adams again. It was his last published story before his death in 2022, so I do appreciate that some people might want to pick it up purely for that reason. He was also the co-creator of the character of Ra's al Ghul. So like I say, Neil Adams had a huge, very important impact on so many comics, not least of all Batman. So if you're a fan of the history of the medium, it's worth looking into his stuff. But if you're basically, basic like me, then don't feel pressure to. As I said, this series was originally going to be entitled Batman Demigod's War. It began being published in September 2019, and then went on hiatus for over a year after issue 4's publication, which was in February 2020. Obviously, that was due to COVID-19, and then the last 2 issues came out in March 21 and I think April 21. The story itself is basically about Ra's al Ghul trying to destroy Gotham and eliminate Batman, etc., etc., etc. Classic Batman Ra's al Ghul stuff. Okay, the next one that we're going to look at is this, which is Death of Hawkman. This came out from 2016 to 2017. Again, it's a 6-issue miniseries. It actually doesn't just revolve around Hawkman. It's about Adam Strange and Hawkman, which is actually kind of predictable. Adam Strange is often pulled into these Thanagarian stories. And the antagonist is Despero. So if you know Despero, the villain, he's the massive purple alien with the Mohican fin on his head. It's written by Mark Andreyko with various artists. Mark Andreyko you may know as the writer who took over Batwoman in the New 52 mid-run. This technically continues in the Adam Strange Future Quest special one-shot, which we're going to be talking about later on in the Licensed Worlds section of my DC Rebirth guide, because right at the end of issue 6, Adam Strange teleports somewhere, and then it turns out, as we'll see in the Future Quest special, that's where he turns up. But the Future Quest special is in the Licensed World section because it's also out of continuity, so I'm more than happy covering that there. Generally speaking, this story, it's definitely out of continuity just because it just is. Some fans will argue it's in continuity. I appreciate that. It's a heroic effort, but the truth is, Hawkman's history is such a convoluted mess that every single one of his stories is arguable as to whether or not it's actually real or in continuity or a hallucination or whatever. So as far as I'm concerned, trust me, you do not need to read this or even have this in your collection if you're looking forward to like the core DC Rebirth read. Alright, next up is Electric Warriors 2019. So this is a 6-issue series. Note that this was never collected in a trade paperback. It is set like hundreds if not thousands of years in the future and seems utterly non-DC at all. In fact, it reads very much like an Image series, but a couple of issues in it transpires that the big bad for the series is actually the character of... Do you know what? I'm not going to say it's a spoiler, but my point is, this is definitely in the DC universe, but it's definitely out of continuity. Freedom Fighters came out from 2019 to 2020. I've actually covered it in a previous video a month or two ago, where I actually custom bound this entire 12 issue maxi series, which in and of itself kind of gives you an idea of how fucking great it is. This is an excellent series. It's set on Earth 10 in the multiverse. It's written by Robert Venditti, who I'm pretty much a fan of. I really liked his stuff in the Valiant universe, and for those of you that don't know, I've done a 77 video guide to the entirety of the Valiant universe. It's got art by Eddie Barrows, which is really good. This is technically Freedom Fighters Volume 3, as in volume with a big V, or Series 3, I guess. Like I said, 12 issue maxi series, really good, really out of continuity. The one kind of Easter egg here is that in issue 6, it confirms this is actually the follow-up to the one-shot Mastermen from the Multiversity, and the Multiversity is that big Grant Morrison story that he did during the New 52 era, which again is out of continuity to the New 52, so this similarly is out of continuity. Inferior 5, which was published from 2019 to 2021, is a series most people haven't heard of at all. It's very easy for this to have slipped under your radar, but if you do see it, it did get published in the DC Rebirth era, starting being published in 2019, and so I'm going to talk about it, but rest assured, it's totally out of continuity. The series is actually a revival of a series of the same name, Inferior 5, that was originally published as 12 issues from 1967 to 1970 something. Now, this one was actually also meant to be a 12-issue series, but after issue 4, it was doing so badly and was so unpopular, it was decided to end it at issue 6. So this is written by Keith Giffen and Jeff Lemire, and actually drawn by Keith Giffen. If you pick it up as single issues, each issue has a Peacemaker mini story, but don't worry about like leaving them all and reading them all in one go at the end. You should actually read them as you go through, because that's kind of how it's designed to be read. So I just read it in sequence as that. So you have Inferior 5 Peacemaker mini, Inferior 5 2 Peacemaker mini, and so on. Like I said, there was quite a lot of publishing delays and issues with this. So the first issue came out in September 2019, but then December 2019 it kind of went on hiatus, with the final 2 issues being delayed, and then obviously COVID-19 happened, delayed it for over a year. The series then started publishing again in March 2021, but the last 2 issues, issues 5 and 6, were only ever released on digital platforms. Obviously you can get them in the trade paperback, but yeah. The story itself is really weird. It's set after an alien invasion in Metropolis. I actually was wondering whether or not this was one of the many alien invasions that happens during the main DC Rebirth continuity, and so initially I didn't think this was out of continuity. But then eventually, reading it, I worked out that the invasion it was referring to was a massive crossover event in the DC universe that was published in 1989. Yeah, genuinely, a 1989 event, which was also plotted by Keith Giffen, the writer of this series. Now, that event from 1989 featured a massive alien alliance led by the Dominators and the Khunds, so they're both different alien races, who were intent on wiping out humanity. That was their way of like getting rid of all Earth superheroes. So this all-out assault led to this massive war and ramifications throughout the DC universe, etc., etc. The story in 1989 was actually published in 3 main issues, but had loads of titles tying into it across all the different DC issues at the time. I haven't read it. I'm not going to read it. I'm not into 80s comics. However, not only is that like a bit of a weird thing that it ties into something that happened before the New 52 Flashpoint reboot, but as well as that, this series is definitely out of continuity purely because it essentially breaks the fourth wall repeatedly in the last 2 issues. One character refers to the Peacemaker TV series and the creator James Gunn, and also it kind of breaks the fourth wall talking to the reader about the fact that the series was meant to be 12 issues and ended up getting cut down to 6. So for a lot of different factors, this just isn't something that needs to be taken seriously as part of DC Rebirth. Okay, and finally for today, I just want to talk about the Commandy Challenge. So the Commandy Challenge came out from 2017 to 2018. Commandy is like a long-standing thing in DC Comics. Commandy, the last boy on Earth. If you're not familiar with him, don't worry. Basically, the tagline is Commandy, last boy on Earth, and he's a teenager who lives in an alternative future where there's been this event called the Great Disaster that turned the world into this kind of like weird primitive state, but ruled by intelligent animals. A little bit Planets of the Apes-y. The original series ran for 59 issues from 1972 to 1978, and it's always been a bit of a cult fan favourite. So what DC did was in 2017, they decided to publish this, the Commandy Challenge. And the reason they did that is that it's the year that would have been Jack Kirby's 100th birthday, if he was still alive. So what is the Commandy Challenge? Well, what they decided to do was over the space of 12 issues, they were going to write a story that was kind of a round robin. So someone would write the first story and then end it on a crazy cliffhanger, which would be like, oh my God, Commandy's about to die or something. And then a brand new creative duo would come in, a different writer, a different artist, and their job was to get Commandy out of that cliffhanger, progress the story however they wanted to, end it on a cliffhanger, and then hand it over to another creative pair who would again have to work it out bit by bit. So it's kind of an interesting idea. I mean, I remember doing something like this at school once. Whether or not this is a good thing to do in a comic you're making for DC, I don't know. But anyway, what we have here is just a list of the 12 issues and the writers and artists for each of those issues. What can I say? Yeah, it was all right. It was really jarring. I mean, it's exactly what you think it'd be. It's 12 issues written by 12 different authors, none of whom had spoken to each other and had to like work it out as they were going along. So it's a bit of a mess. It's kind of wacky. Yeah, I wouldn't really massively recommend it. If you get the trade paperback, it also has a particular one-shot in it, which is called the Commandy Challenge Special One-Shot, which is reprints a bunch of the original issues. But yeah, this is definitely out of continuity. Don't worry about picking it up if you don't want to. Okay, with those out of the way, I'm just going to pause there, and that's going to be the end of this video. We're going to have a part 2 for the out of continuity section, because there's just quite a lot to talk about. So come back in a few days, and we'll cover the rest of the out of continuity ones on this thumbnail. And then we'll talk about why these 2 are at the bottom here, and why all the Green Lantern are over to one side on the left. And we'll talk about that in sequence. But hopefully that was useful. Thank you everyone who's been watching and commenting and watching along. Hopefully this continues to be useful and helpful. Hopefully the pace of the videos is enough and you're not getting bored or annoyed by that. As I say, I know everyone is waiting and everyone is really keen for that hardcore core DC Universe continuity guide. But like I say, to build up momentum to it and to build up the hype a little bit, all I'm doing is trimming off all the fat around the edges. Were there any series in what I've said already today that you were surprised I've considered to be out of continuity? Were you expecting to read The Batman's Grave or Bane Conquest or Deadman or something like that? Are you surprised those are out of continuity? Let me know your thoughts. And as always, everybody, please support the channel by watching, liking, subscribing, and especially picking up my novel No Gods or Kings from Amazon. It's free if you've got Kindle Unlimited. And as always, until the next time, everybody, please just stay classy.